Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlene and today we're going to be starting another reading vlog. Okay, first of all, if I seem tired while I'm filming this, it's because I already filmed this once and then discovered that my camera didn't record it. And not that I didn't hit the record button, because I checked. It recorded for about 15 seconds and apparently about the time I looked away, it stopped recording and I don't know why. So I'm a little frustrated at the moment. So I'm not entirely certain what I'm going to call this vlog. There are several books I want to get to that have some different feels to them, and right now I'm leaning towards calling it like unsettling books. But basically these are books that just have kind of a creepier, unsettling undertone. They might have more of a gothic feel to them, they might be unsettling in some other way, but that's kind of what I'm thinking of right now. So I do have two books that I've already started. And the first one is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And currently I am 2 chapters into this one, so not very far at all. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little confused about what's going on. We're following a character named Lockwood. He pays a visit to Mr. Heathcliff, who is, I don't know the actual term. Mr. Lockwood is his tenant. So he has a house and works land in a part of Mr. Heathcliff's estate. And so he goes to visit him because he's the new tenant. And in the first chapter, he really only meets Mr. Heathcliff. In the second chapter, he meets his daughter-in-law and also Mr. Earnshaw. I have heard people say that this is actually a revenge story. It's not a romance. So I'm already well aware that it's not necessarily the type of story I thought it was years ago. But beyond that, I really know nothing about this book. So I'm still kind of lost, still kind of figuring out what's going on here. So curious to see where the rest of the book goes, but I know this one has a darker tone to it. So that's why I'm reading it for this vlog. And then the other book I'm currently working on is in a very different vein, and that is The Nightmare Virus by Nadine Brandes. This one's unsettling for a very different reason. In this book, people are coming down with what they're calling the nightmare virus. And the nightmare virus is caused by injections people would get that would send them into a dreamscape. So a company came up with this facility where people could go in, and from what I understand, you basically lay down on a bed, they give you an injection, it puts you to sleep, and while you're there, you're living in this dreamscape. So whatever kind of world you want to live in, whatever you want to happen, that's what happens. But people started coming down with the nightmare virus, and they eventually realized that the injections people got to go into this dreamscape was getting into their systems and mutating into this virus. And when people catch it, they have 22 days until they just go to sleep and never wake up. The way it basically works is the first day that you catch it, you fall asleep for an hour, like it's completely out of your control. But you fall asleep for an hour, then you're awake for 23 hours. The second day you fall asleep for 2 hours, then you're awake for 22 hours, and so on. But on the 22nd day, instead of going to sleep for 22 hours and being awake for 2, you just go to sleep and you don't wake up. So the virus doesn't necessarily kill people per se, because it's not like on day 22 you just die from it. It's just that people go to sleep, and because they don't wake up, they don't eat, they don't get hydrated, they don't do anything that helps their bodies to stay alive. And so they eventually mostly just die of starvation and dehydration. It's possible that someone could also die of a medical condition, like if they're diabetic and they don't get their insulin, or they hit a blood sugar low or whatever. Different things like that could also cause people to die, but it sounds like the majority of people die because their body just basically starves to death. So in this book, we're following a man named Kane. He and his brother, from what I understand, are in college, so I'm assuming probably early 20s. And his brother, Noel or Nole, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, has come down with the virus. And the two of them are trying to work together to figure out a cure. And they're hoping Kane won't catch it, because he only went into the dreamscape once, whereas Nole was going into the dreamscape about once a week for research for one of his classes. But Kane does end up coming down with it. At this point, I'm 4 chapters in, and we are getting to see the dreamscape, or the nightmare dreamscape, from Kane's perspective. and he's trying to piece things together. He talks about his brother is the more mathematical one. He runs the math equations to figure out a cure. Kane is the more creative one. And so he wants to know what Nole has been seeing in the nightmare dreamscape, thinking that there might be a clue somewhere as to a cure from what is there. And so now he's in the dreamscape and trying to figure out what's there, what's going on, what can he learn from it, and all of that. So far, I'm really enjoying the book, and it's definitely got me intrigued with seeing this nightmare dreamscape and how things are playing out. So it's not quite as creepy as I thought it was going to be, because I was assuming it was more like people have hallucinations and stuff like that, and so it was like I knew when people went to sleep they had nightmares, but I thought like that was part of it, but then there were also nightmares during the day because of hallucinating, and that's really not it. But still, this whole thing of you come down with a virus and you're on a ticking time clock for how much time you have left to live. It's really interesting. So I'm enjoying it so far, but at this point we're really only seeing the dreamscape for the first time through Kane's perspective. So I'm curious as to what's going to happen, like when he wakes up, when he goes back to it again, like how does it change? How does he change? All of that. So I don't know if it's going to have the super unsettling undertones that I thought it was going to have, but it very well could. We'll just have to see as the story goes. So those are the two books that I'm working on right now. I have about 3 other books I'm hoping to get to this month that would fit into this vlog, but at this point I have no idea how fast I'm going to even get through these 2 books or what other books I would get to. So if I do get to any more books, I'll just talk about them as I get to them. But right now, these 2 are the main priority. But I believe that's all I have for now. So I will see you again when I read a little bit more of these books and have a little bit more to talk about with them. I don't even know where to start this update. That's bad, right? I should know where to start. Alright, so it has been several days since I've updated you guys, but I've made a lot of progress in the nightmare virus, and I want to talk about it before I finish the book. So at this point, I'm about that far in. I am on page 264 at the beginning of chapter 30. So I'm getting pretty close to being done with the book. But there are a lot of things that I'm kind of seeing play out, some things that I think are going to happen. And I kind of want to talk about them before I finish the book, because otherwise it feels like if I'm right, me coming on here and saying I predicted all of this, it's like it's easy to say in hindsight, but did you actually see it coming? So I wanted to go ahead and talk about it now. Also, I want to talk about it before I get to the very end, because I have no idea how this is ultimately going to wrap up. I will be honest, I read the first couple chapters before I did the first update, like 2 to 4 chapters. And I liked it well enough, but I wasn't enthralled with it. But not long after that, it really started picking up. And I've been engrossed with this book. It's one of those books where I should be done by now, because it's very hard to put down. But I just haven't had a whole lot of time to read. And over the past weekend, I hit a major reading slump. I just have a lot of books on my TBR this month, and it finally got to the point of I think I was just too stressed out by the number of books I wanted to get to that I kind of hit a reading slump. Because that's what tends to happen to me. That's how I end up in reading slumps, is I either try to cram in a bunch of reading and get burned out, or I get very stressed out by the amount of reading I have. And whenever I get stressed out about something, it may start out as I have all of this motivation to get all this work done, but after a few days and there's still a lot to do, I kind of just mentally shut down. And it's hard for me to want to do anything. So unfortunately, this last weekend was kind of that feeling. I just had so much stress when it came to reading because I want to get through all of these books. I decided after the weekend, I'm just going to slow it down. I still have a lot of books I want to get to, but we're just going to see what I get through. This book and about 2 or 3 others are my top priorities for the month. If I get to any more than that, great. If I don't, it's fine. Since changing my mindset, I've made a lot more progress in this book. So where I was at, I believe, when I did the first update, is I just knew the bare basics. Kane got the virus and entered this nightmare dreamscape. And I really knew nothing more than that because chapter 5, I think, is the first chapter where we see him in the nightmare dreamscape. I really didn't know anything more than that. I'm trying to figure out how much I can say that's non-spoilery before I go into the spoilery section. So, the nightmare dreamscape, without going into spoilery details, is not a very safe place. It always starts out with people being in this really dark place. Like, you can't see anything. But some people manage to find their way out of that. And where they end up after that is very brutal, very dangerous. And we also discover as we get further into the story that there's kind of 2 warring factions within this nightmare dreamscape. I'm not going to say any more than that because I don't want to give anything away if you haven't read it, but those are just some of the things that are going on. Kane is also dealing with, every time he wakes up, he's dealing with consequences of decisions that he made in the real world, because he and his brother Nole were trying to find a cure for the nightmare virus, and Kane is still trying to work on that in the real world whenever he's awake. And so as he makes new discoveries, as he tries to do different things, we see the consequences in both the real world and in this nightmare world. It's very interesting how it all ties together, and I'm really enjoying the story, and it's very fast-paced compared to a lot of her other books, at least her other books that I've read. I think that's about all I can say that's non-spoilery. So at this point, I'm going to get into spoilers because there's some things I really want to talk about with this book. So if you haven't read this book and you don't want to be spoiled for it, there will be timestamps down below where you can skip ahead. Or if it's easier for you, you can mute the video until this image disappears. Alright, so at the point that I'm at in the story, Kane is on his last awake, as he calls it. So he has an hour that he's going to, he has 2 hours that he's going to be awake. Then once he falls asleep again, he's just asleep. So time is ticking by very quickly. I'm going to kind of go through some of my tabs here to try to remember some of the things that I thought about. Some of the things very early on is like when he meets Luce. And he said his name is Luce as in lucid. So I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. I did like that Kane was like, do you have a last name? Like Ifer? Because that's kind of what Luce was reminding me of. I didn't trust Luce from the beginning. Mostly because he was the first one to come out of the tunnels. He was the fastest one to come out of the tunnels before Kane. And he created this world into what it is. Because he says, this world was quite different from the one you see now. Empty, void, dark and overrun by shadows. I had to learn quickly or die. So I was suspicious of Luce from the get-go just because I see this world that he's created and I'm like, why do we trust the guy who made a world that looks like this? Because it's like you have to fight in an arena to gain your citizenship. You have to kill someone in order to gain your citizenship. And I'm like, why is that a thing? Why is that how you decided who gets to stay in your city and who doesn't? And why should we trust the guy who sets things up that way? I also noted that he was the fastest one to get out of the tunnel prior to Kane, and he was the first one. What are the odds? So there were just things about Luce that were very suspicious from the get-go. And I'm going to preface all of this with, I realize that this is a YA book, and I am a 30-something-year-old adult. So me figuring out a lot of the things in this book doesn't overly surprise me because I'm not the target audience. Because I'm pretty sure if I was reading this when I was in high school, there's probably a lot of this that I would not have thought of or figured out. So I realize I'm coming at it from a different vantage point. So take the fact that I figured this out with a grain of salt, because this is just how my mind works. I become very suspicious of a lot of things in books anymore. Then when Luce is talking about the spores, and he mentions that they take children. He says, the spores kidnap our children to use them. At the very beginning of the story, when Cain first encounters the spores, one of the girls is taken, and another spore calls out her name. And I'm like, that doesn't sound to me like someone who just kidnaps children to use them. It sounded to me like this was a mother calling out because her child was getting taken. Like, you called the child by name. It's not, like, no, don't take the kids from us or something. It's, she called out the name. She knows this child. That to me doesn't sound like they're just kidnapping random children. I think it's also one of those when it's like, this is the person who set up the world and they say, we don't trust these people and I'm not trusting him. I immediately want to trust the other people. So there's that as well. Also noted in, I'll try to actually give chapter numbers because I know they're doing that. Chapter 14, that Noli makes a comment about the fact that a spore comes in on a phoenix. And I'm like, again, we're seeing the spores as the bad guys and Luce and the people in the Colosseum as the good guys. Do we not notice an odd thing here with the fact that the spore comes in on a phoenix, whereas everybody in the Colosseum has stuff made out of night mist that's like black and smoky? Do we not see a contrast here? Which one actually seems like the lighter side versus the darker side? Again, there were different things coming up where I know Cain was making assumptions and I know why he was making assumptions, but it's still like, if you really look at it, it doesn't really add up, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of comments made in this book that are related to the Christian faith. And so, honestly, I look at a lot of this and I'm like, this feels like, being a Christian, to people on the outside, they're like, it doesn't make sense. I don't agree with your beliefs. I don't know why you would stick to this so strongly. And to people who are Christians, it's like, why would we do anything else? So that's kind of how I see the spores versus Luce and the Colosseum. Now, there are a couple questions that I have, or a couple things that I'm wondering. So first of all, this is in chapter 26. When Cain goes to the spores hideout, we'll call it. When Strena goes in to talk to a few people, there's a man laying in a bed. And Cain sees that he's there, but he can't see his face. The only thing he's able to make out is that his feet are bloody. I'm always suspicious of anything where it's like you can't see who a person is. Because I'm just kind of like, okay, you can't see the person now. But there's probably someone you're going to see later that if you had seen the person, then you would realize this is the same person. So immediately when it's, I can't see the person's face, I'm on the lookout for who could this person be. And what I'm wondering is if the person in the bed isn't Galilei, the person that Luce says is his father. Is Galilei actually his father? I don't know. Is he actually the draftsman? Possibly. It doesn't help my suspicions that after the raid on the Spores hideout, in chapter 28, is when the attack on the Spores hideout happens. Cain sees Galilei. So, he sees his face, he doesn't see his feet. In the other one, he sees the guy's feet, he doesn't see his face. So, I'm immediately wondering if Galilei isn't the guy who was in the bed in the Spore hideout. Also, what makes me curious is the fact that after they got Cain out of the hideout and he's in prison, Luce tells him that they finally got his dad out of the tunnels. And I'm like, that's ironic timing. You got him out of the tunnels at the same time you got the spores out of their hideout. So, that's what's making me think that Galilei is the one who was in the hideout. Now, obviously, I have a lot of questions. Is Galilei actually his father? Is he actually the draftsman? And if so, why has this arena and everything been able to be created? Like, did something happen between Galilei and Luce? But one thing that he mentioned, and I don't think I tabbed it, is he says that Galilei looks more like Luce's grandfather than his father, and said he must have married someone pretty young to have a son who's 20 years old. And I think that was one of the things I wondered at one point in the book, but kind of went, no, I don't think that would be possible, is I wondered if Luce actually looked different than he does in the Nightmare Virus. But I was like, I don't think anyone can change their appearances. But then again, Luce can do a lot of things that other people can't do, even Kane. And so, did he change his appearance to look younger? Is he actually older? And now all of a sudden I'm sitting here wondering, is Luce actually part of the Nightmare Virus? Is that why he can do all this? He's not a person from the real world. And is he trying to get the Nightmare Virus to take control so then he controls everyone? Because he talks about that Galilei has the cure. Well, there's a cure among the spores in that there are times that they're able to wake up. And so is he either wanting to find out that cure, either to wake up in the real world himself, or if he has the person who has the cure and gets rid of him, then he can potentially prevent other people from gaining the cure. So I don't know. But that's kind of my speculations right now. I'm guessing Galilei was among the spores. Whether he's actually Luce's father or not, we don't know. Is Luce actually 20-something years old? We don't know. Curious to see how the rest of this book plays out, but really enjoying it so far. I think that's it on this one for now, which is probably a good thing. I've talked long enough. Now, Wuthering Heights. I've made no progress. So I'm still 2 chapters in. My hope at this point is to finish the Nightmare Virus here in the next day or 2, and then I will work on Wuthering Heights. Because I do need to get to this one, but I'm really enjoying this one, and I don't really want to put it down to have to read this one. So, that's where I'm at with those. I obviously haven't picked up anything else yet, so I don't have anything to tell you on what other books I may or may not want to read. So, at this point, I have some work to do on getting some stuff ready for our homeschool for next week. And then I have a lot of work to do around the house. So I'm going to go work on that. And I will talk to you probably whenever I finish the Nightmare Virus. Hey guys, so I finished The Nightmare Virus by Nadine Brandes, and this was such a good book. It's very fast-paced. It just has so much really good Christian faith content in it as well. I don't know how I feel about the ending, but at the same time, in this world and the way things are going, it does make sense. I feel like overall, the book did a very good job of depicting the difference between the light and the darkness as it comes to Christian religion. You know, God and the angels versus the devil and the demons. I feel like this illustrated it in a very different way from what we're used to seeing, and I feel like it was done really well. Even though it involves a virus that sends you to this nightmare dreamscape, I still feel like it was such a good illustration of those two sides. And I really enjoyed it for that. And despite the fact that, like I said, I don't entirely know how I feel about the ending, I do at least feel like the book ends on a note of hope. At this point, I'm going to go into a little bit more with spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled for this book, There will be timestamps down below where you can skip ahead or you can mute the video until this image disappears. I think in the last update, I was making a lot of speculations about what I thought was ultimately going to happen. Some of it I had at least kind of the right idea. Some of it I did not, and some of it wasn't answered. So, the question that wasn't answered is, who is the man with the spores? I don't know how to say the Greek word, so we're just going to call him spores. Who had the bloody feet? The one that everybody was meeting with prior to the attack on the spores. We never actually find out who that was. No, it wasn't Galilei, which is what I was initially thinking. But we don't actually know who it is. And then, as far as Galilei himself, I think, if I remember right, my prediction at the time was that Galilei was actually working with the spores. It all made sense, like he's the man with the bloody feet because we never see his face. Luce says we got him out of the tunnels around the same time that the attack on the spores happened. So it all kind of lined up, it made sense. But I think it was not long after I got past that part that I started wondering instead if it was going to turn out that Galilei was Luce. And the reason I started wondering is because when Cain, sorry, I blanked on his name. When Cain goes back to the real world and gets the life pod set up for Galilei, when he comes back, Luce suddenly looks much healthier. He looks stronger. He's not in a wheelchair. Like, he was looking not very good when Cain left. He was pale. He was weak. He was to the point he couldn't walk. Like, he was not looking good. And as soon as Cain comes back, all of a sudden he has energy again. He doesn't look sickly. And I started to wonder, are Luce and Galilei the same person? My initial thought was that Luce was somehow a night mist creation that Galilei made. And so it's like, here's a night mist version of myself that can't be harmed or killed. Or if it is, I can just create a new one. And I don't have to worry about my body being harmed. As far as the ending, the biggest thing is the fact that in the end, the virus wins. Like, is really how it feels. And while on one hand, I was hoping in the end there would be a cure, the nightmare would be over, but at the same time, it makes sense. Galilei is not just going to give up what the cure is. He wants to rule this world. He wants the people in this world. If there is a cure and he knows what it is, he doesn't want to give that up. So in the end, it does make sense. But their hope is not in returning to the real world and in life going on like it used to. Their hope is in eternity. Overall, really enjoyed this book. At this point, I don't think I've read a Nadine Brandes book that's gotten less than 4 stars. And this was definitely a 5-star read. Very glad that I read this. Glad it also didn't mess with my head like I thought it might. But I will say the darkness aspect does let this fit, at least to an extent, with this unsettling vlog. Because there are dark things going on. And obviously going through getting this virus, being trapped in this nightmare dreamscape is very unsettling. Now, me personally, as someone who doesn't do really dark books, who doesn't do horror, this one didn't bother me. If you're concerned about that, it really doesn't have any kind of horror aspect, but there is, I guess, a little more along the lines of like a thriller feel, where you don't always know who you can trust, you don't always know what's going to happen, what's actually the best option, what's the safe choice. There's a lot of uncertainty with this book, but it makes for a really good, compelling story. And I know I've heard some people complain about the number of pop culture references, especially fandom references, but I'm not surprised. If you follow Nadine Brandes online, you will know that she and her family are big into fandoms. They don't give out their kids' names online, but they have given them nicknames like Halfling. So I know Nadine Brandes is big into Lord of the Rings and other fandoms, so it doesn't surprise me that these pop up in her books, and it didn't bother me that it did, but I know that has bothered some people. So just know before you read this book, there are pop culture references to things like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and so on. All right, and then I also wanted to give an update on this book before I end up finishing it, because Man, I don't know what to think of this book, but Wuthering Heights. I did finally make progress on it. I am currently on page 181, so I have about 150 pages left. And I'm hoping to have this finished by the end of October. Today is literally October 31st. So, I don't know for sure if I'm going to get it done, but I'm going to try. If not, it should be very early November. But so far, this book is a trip. And I understand now why people going into this book thinking it's a romance would be extremely confused. This does not read like a romance at all. And I know some people have said it's a revenge story, and by the time I get to the end, I may 100% agree. At this point, I would say I like 50 to 80% agree. So if you, like me, have heard about this book but have no idea what it's about, let me at least give you a little bit of a synopsis. This is a story within a story. So we start out meeting Mr. Lockwood, who is a new tenant of Wuthering Heights. He doesn't live at Wuthering Heights. He lives at a different house on the property or in the vicinity that is technically run by Wuthering Heights, by Mr. Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights. He goes to visit Mr. Heathcliff because he's the master of the estate and doesn't really like the reception he gets. And so he starts talking to the, I guess you would call her maid of his house, and starts asking her questions. Like, he wants to know more about Mr. Heathcliff and this family, but he doesn't want to just outright ask. And so he starts asking a few questions just to see, what is she willing to tell me? How much is she willing to tell me? And in the end, she goes on a long story, and it takes months to cover this story. So we have different starting and stopping points. But she tells the story of Heathcliff and Catherine and Hindley. Those are the primary characters that we follow in this story. Also the Lintons, because they get involved as well. But she tells the story of these people, they're growing up, because she starts when, I think Catherine's about 6. We see Heathcliff come into the family, how he became part of the family, and we see the repercussions of him being in the family and how he was viewed, how he was treated by everyone, and what effect that had on him and the lives of those around him. That's the simplest way that I can sum it up without going into more spoilery details. Yeah, this would definitely lean more towards a revenge story than a love story, because I do think it's an adequate enough way to describe it. Yes, we do go into the romantic lives of these characters, but it is not a romance. Honestly, there are times that I have been very unsure about a lot of these characters, because there's part of me that wants to go, why do you put up with this? Why do you not just put your foot down and do this? But at the same time, I realize because of certain social situations, their hands are tied. There's only so much they can do. To me, this feels like a very easy, compelling read. And maybe it's because it's a story within a story. I know someone's telling the story, and so that makes it easier for me to read, because I do tend to like those kind of stories, just like I like epistolary novels. It's also a hard story to read because just looking at the situation that these characters get themselves into, or the way the characters act that just make you go, what are you thinking? Makes it sometimes a very hard or frustrating story to read as well. I don't think I really have any spoilery comments at this point. No, I take it back. I will have just a short spoilery section on this book. So again, if you don't want to be spoiled for this one, there will be timestamps down below, or you can mute the video until this image disappears. And mostly what I want to talk about is the family dynamics at the point that I'm at. I'm going to be talking about some characters who have passed away. So again, if you don't want to be spoiled, timestamps image. We've had 2 characters pass away, and we know a third one is going to. So the first one was Catherine, and the second one was Hindley. And this has caused a complete overturn. Heathcliff now owns Wuthering Heights because of Hindley's passing. With Catherine gone, there's nothing to stop him from harming Edgar Linton or trying to take advantage of him or whatever. So the tables have really turned at the point that we're at. And we also know that Heathcliff's wife has run away. And when her son is about 12, she will end up passing away. And that's really all we know at this point. So at the beginning of the book, we had Catherine, son of Catherine and Edward, who is a widow. And she was married to Heathcliff's son. So I'm going to assume that's the son that... What is her first name? Mrs. Heathcliff. All of a sudden, I can't think of her first name. But Edgar's sister. I assume it's going to be the son that she runs away with. So how this son ends up back in Heathcliff's household, I don't know. We also know that things don't go well for Hareton. Or however, Hareton, I don't know how to say his name. Hindley's son. According to Mrs. Dean, the housemaid, it seems like he doesn't realize that he has lost an inheritance to Heathcliff. So there's all sorts of interesting dynamics here. Also with people calling this a revenge story. Like, in a way, I guess I could see this being a revenge story of Heathcliff feeling, like Hindley didn't approve of him, the Lintons didn't approve of him, eventually Mrs. Dean didn't, and taking his revenge. But at the same time, his adoptive father doted on him. Catherine loved him. And still, he is causing this harm to her family. Yes, in a lot of ways, Heathcliff wasn't treated well. But even with those who did treat him well, he wasn't always the kindest to them. Catherine especially. Because to me, it almost reminds me that because his adoptive father doted on him so much, he almost expected to just inherit Wuthering Heights and or to marry Catherine because of the way that she felt about him. And when that ultimately didn't happen, some of it for reasons of his own doing, he decided he was going to take it by any means necessary. Even though he really had no right to it. He was not the oldest. He was adopted. He didn't have a right to that property. But it seemed like he was going to take it no matter what it took. And so I'm not so sure on the revenge part as much as I'm going to take whatever I want, whether I deserve it or not. So that's why I'm a little iffy on the revenge part of it, because I'm like, if it's revenge, it's some of it, not all of it, but some of it feels like unprovoked revenge. Or, okay, maybe the person was the nicest, maybe they said something you didn't like or didn't agree with, or you felt attacked, but it was small, it was brief, and you're letting that overshadow all of the positive things from that person. Because the biggest thing is the fact that Catherine makes a comment about him to Mrs. Dean that he overhears, and then he runs out of the house and runs away for 3 years. And it's one of those things where it's like, Catherine has been your closest friend. She is the one who has understood you the best. She's the one who has loved you despite how much she understands you. And yet, you let all of that friendship and all of that kindness, all of that understanding be overshadowed by this one comment. In the end, he couldn't have her, so he's making everybody who did have her miserable and take out his vengeance on everybody else because he was slighted once by her. It feels petty because taking vengeance on her and her family, her and anybody related to her, mostly because of their difference in station, the difference in their lot in life, and one comment that Catherine probably regretted, feels very petty. Now, Hindley, I understand why Heathcliff is seeking revenge on Hindley. Hindley was never nice to him. Hindley never liked him. Edgar Linton, very unsure about him. Not comfortable around him, didn't trust him. And we see why. Heathcliff did not act in ways that warranted trust a lot of times. And you could say it's because of his lot in life. You could say it's because of how he was treated. But he didn't do much to try to instill trust in him in other people. And Linton was never as aggressively against him as Hindley was. But he was very distrustful of him, and it felt like every time he came around Catherine, Catherine suddenly did worse. And I think, honestly, Edgar was well aware of Catherine's feelings for Heathcliff. And he didn't want to have to compete with another man for his wife's affections. And I don't think we can blame him for that. He loved Catherine. He wanted Catherine to love him. And he didn't want this man around that Catherine potentially loved more than him. They got mad about Edgar's jealousy, but Edgar had a right to be jealous, in my opinion. So yeah, there's a whole lot of things we could cover with this book, but I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. Like I said, I'm hoping to have this book done by the end of the day. I don't know if that'll happen. If not, hopefully in the next day or two, and I can give you a final update on it. I think that's all I have for right now, and I hope so because my hand is tired from holding up the books. But I will be back whenever I finish Wuthering Heights to give you a final update. Alright, so I am back for the final update on Wuthering Heights. I did manage to finish this before the end of October. I don't really know how. I will be perfectly honest, because that was 150 pages in one day, but I managed to finish it. So, general thoughts on this book. I don't even know where to start. In some ways, I'm still trying to collect my thoughts when it comes to this book, because there's a lot going on. In some ways, I feel like this book is really just exploring the darker side of humanity and the lengths that some people are willing to go to get what they want, what they think is due to them, and to just kind of lash out when what they want is denied to them. However, I will say the book does end on a more hopeful note, and I did really like the way that it wrapped up the story. So when people say this is a story of revenge, I'm pretty much at the mindset now of that's a good way to look at it. When I did my last update, I said I wasn't sure if I would really use the term revenge because it really just felt like pettiness. But reading more of the book, really having time to sit with it, I do feel like this is some sort of vengeance. Now, is it all justified? That I'm not so sure. I would say no to that. But I think that is the mindset of one of the characters in particular, is that this is all about vengeance for whatever slight the character feels like they may have endured. It is a really interesting story. It is a very different story. I can understand why it may not have been well received at the time in which it was written. I also understand why, if people go into this book hearing it's a love story, they walk away from it very confused, because this is not a love story. Are there characters who are in love with each other in this book? Yes. Is it a story about their love? In a way. Is it a love story? No. So, do not go into this book at all thinking that this is a love story, because it is absolutely not. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and go into the final spoilers on this book. So if you don't want to be spoiled for this book, There will be timestamps down below where you can skip ahead, or you can mute the video until this image disappears. So at the point I was last time, I forgot to actually say the chapter in the update, but I was just 2 or 3 chapters, I think, into, okay, maybe a little bit more than that. Okay, yeah. I was 3 chapters into volume 2. So where I was at was after the point where Catherine had already passed away. Catherine was gone, Hindley was gone, and yes, everything up to that point, I was like, this is 100% pettiness. Because honestly, it's like, again, Heathcliff's issues with Hindley, I 100% understand. Hindley was horrible to him. His issues with Catherine, though, and the Lintons, I didn't understand quite as much. Catherine obviously cared about him. You can even say she loved him. I think part of his issue is the fact that he left and she married Edgar Linton. I think that was the second part of his issue with her. I think his first issue with her was during the, 12 weeks or something, or 12 days that she spent with the Lintons. When she came home, she was a different person in his mind. She actually had times where she dressed nicely, she acted more refined, she wasn't lashing out at people, she wasn't rough and tumble tomboy anymore, or whatever she may have been. And so I think when she came home from that visit, he saw there's a difference in her now from before she was there. And I think all of a sudden he saw her as not being the same as him. And so I think that's where a lot of it started. It's where it seems like a lot of it started. And then she obviously spent time with Edgar. She spent time with him as she was growing up. And then she made the comment to Mrs. Dean about Heathcliff that was not so positive. And he got mad. He stormed out. He ran away. And he disappeared. And I think it was only 2 or 3 months after he left that she got married to Edgar. So when he comes back 3 years later, I'm sure the fact that she was married to Edgar really upset him. And I'm pretty sure he mentions at one point that, like, he was gone and not long after that, she was married to Edgar. So yes, part of it could be because of the fact that she got married so soon after he left to someone else. But he left without a word. He never sent word to her. So even by the time she got married, she had no way of knowing if he was ever coming back. And the thing is, he can use the excuse of, you got married so soon after I left. But I honestly think that even if she had waited 2 years after he left, he still would have been upset that she ultimately married Edgar. And either didn't seek him out or didn't wait for him. So honestly, a lot of what I saw with Heathcliff was just excuses. Excuses for his bad behavior. And, reasons to seek revenge on people. And I think a lot of it was that he already wanted to seek revenge. He just wanted to have excuses for why this was okay. And this was just another reason. But then the fact that he is so cruel to Catherine's daughter. And maybe because Catherine looks, or maybe I should say Kathy, looks more like her dad than her mom. But he does not remotely try to take care of her. And so I think that's just a sign that while he cared for Catherine, once she married Edgar, unless he had a way of getting Catherine away from Edgar, he ultimately was against her. And taking out his frustration at the fact that she married Edgar and she never left Edgar for him, is shown in the treatment of her daughter. He may have said that he wanted to be buried with her and he wanted to be with her for eternity, but here on earth, he did not forgive what she had done. And I mean, I think we understand why he treated Hareton the way he did, Hindley's son. Because as I said, Hindley was awful to him. So that part makes sense. But it's the treatment of Catherine that really just shows the type of person that he is. Because Catherine the older, her only her biggest transgression against him is the fact that she married Edgar. And the fact that she wasn't always the person who was identical to Heathcliff. And honestly, looking at Catherine and the fact that she married Edgar, I do think that part of the reason she married Edgar is because she recognized that while she had a lot of things in common with Heathcliff, and while they got along really well, and she did have a love for him, I feel like part of her recognized that Heathcliff was not the right person for her to marry. The saying is opposites attract, and there's a reason for that. We do want to marry people who have similar beliefs and opinions as we do, especially when it comes to the big things. But the reason opposites tend to attract is because your strengths might be their weakness and their strengths might be your weakness. You complement each other. And so with Kathy and Heathcliff being so similar to each other, I don't think it's a marriage that could have thrived. They're too similar. They would have had the same strengths, the same weaknesses, and I think it would have ultimately failed. And I have a feeling that Kathy recognized that. It's not said that way in the book, but spending time with Edgar, seeing the type of person she is around him, seeing how he cares for her, despite the one outburst that she had with Mrs. Dean, I think she saw something in Edgar towards her and something in herself when she was around Edgar that made her more comfortable with that marriage than the idea of marrying Heathcliff. Now, you could argue that it was for money. Edgar had money to offer her, Heathcliff did not. And it's possible that that was a reason. We're not actually given the reason why Catherine chose Edgar. She had reasons that she gave Mrs. Dean, and Mrs. Dean brushed them all off as those are horrible reasons. So we don't ultimately know why she picked Edgar, but I feel like part of it was probably that she recognized Heathcliff was not as good a match for her as Edgar was. For whatever the reason might be, I think she recognized that this would not be a good, stable marriage. That they needed someone to balance them both out. She found that in Edgar. He did not find that with anybody. So, that's kind of my take on that. You can feel free to argue with me in the comments if you want. I'm sure there are a lot of viewpoints when it comes to this book, but those are probably my main thoughts on this. Also, as I said in the non-spoilery section, I did really like the ending to the story. I felt like it wrapped up on a very hopeful note, especially with Kathy and Hareton. You know, the fact that essentially their inheritance is returned to them by the end of the story. And the two of them seem like they're going to be very happy together. So in the end, things worked out. But man, was it a rough time getting there. Alright, so that is all I have for this vlog. I didn't get a whole lot of reading done for it. I originally had about 4, 5, 6 books that I was hoping to get to for this vlog, but that's not what ultimately happened. Because I just kind of hit a bit of a reading slump in the second half of the month, especially the early part, and just kind of struggled to get the momentum going again. It did finally get going. Unfortunately, by that point, it was almost the end of the month. So this is what we have. But I did finish The Nightmare Virus by Nadine Brandes, which I really enjoyed, highly recommend. And I finished Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. So overall, not doing too bad. But that's all I have for you guys for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you've read any of the books that I talked about, let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. And again, if you want to argue with any of my opinions, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Other than that, I hope you all are having a wonderful day, and I'll see you later.